When he'd stepped to the edge of the chasm, there had been a line of retreat. This time, there was nothing. No way to fight or avoid that black beast. Nothing between him and the storm. Welcome to The Storming Journey, a sacred text reading of The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This podcast may contain spoilers for the Stormlight Archive through Wind and Truth. Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Storming Journey. I am Liz, and I will be your Ardent for this episode, where we are discussing Chapter 34, Storm Wall, and Chapter 35, A Light by Which to See from the Way of Kings.
I'm Elle, and I'll be your Worldsinger for today.
And I'm Adam, and I am today's Veristitalian.
So this episode, unsurprisingly, if you're familiar with the Kaladin chapters in which a storm wall happens, is a hard one for me to do a specific world singing on. Not because I can't find anything, but because I simply have too many instances, which is not ideal. I've had PMDD, which is, I don't remember exactly what it stands for, but it's PMS, but it's worse since depression. Since college, and then possibly longer than that, but my memory's a little fuzzy in my high school years. And I've had treatment-resistant depression with 2016, so we are coming up on 10 years this July. It's terrifying.
Happy anniversary?
Yeah, I know. It's also the 10-year anniversary of my husband and I getting married this summer, and so it's like, oh, cool. So 10-year anniversary is also wrapped up in emotionally a different 10-year anniversary. So since I have PMDD on top of regular depression, the PMDD moments are often the ones that are when my mental health takes the greatest hit and it becomes much harder to function. And so for me, the world singing relates more to the first chapter where Kaladin is going through this storm and he does not know if he is going to survive. For me, like, my real life is not a novel. And just because I have a super difficult week or a very difficult instant, I'm not going to get a Stormlight flare at the end where I used up Stormlight or whatever. A lot of people can and do get that where their very dark, stormy night leads to them seeking treatment, and then the treatment they try works and they find something that improves their health. And I have just not been lucky enough to find something that works for me yet. So I still feel like I'm in the first chapter of this reading, more or less continually, cyclically, where Kaladin is just riding out the storm and not knowing if he is going to survive.
I want to thank you for that, Elle, and sharing that with us. I think it's really important that we realize that, we don't always know when the dark night is going to end. And we're going to try to do this episode in respect of that difficulty, because that's part of it.
All right, so I have our Storm's Eye view. Consequences follow Kaladin's side carry. Lamoral executed. Kaladin tied up to the side of his barracks to be judged by the Stormfather. Bridge 4 bids him farewell, and Kaladin gambles everything for their loyalty. The next day, they will look up at his storm-torn body, and his eyes will snap open. The storm wall hits. Flailing in the storm, Kaladin clutches a sphere for luck. Syl keeps the storm at bay, and the face of the Stormfather appears. After the storm, Teft and Bridge 4 walk out to see Kaladin's eyes snap open.
I'm going to grab tissues, because I know I'm going to need them.
Dear listener, this is going to be another Everyone Cries episode, so prepare yourself.
Absolutely. I was I still didn't get tissues and put them over here, and that is a mistake. So, yeah, I wanted to talk about this chapter and the next chapter through the theme. My initial thought was The Dark Night of the Soul, but it's pretty long. That's a long title, so I decided to summarize it with the word surrender. And we the phrase "the dark night of the soul" is part of our cultural context. We use it a lot of the time, but a year ago, I was in a class where we actually read the text where this phrase comes from, which is by St. John of the Cross. And he writes about the dark night of the soul as a spiritual thing, which I think we've kind of lost some of that implication. And I wanted to read from St. John of the Cross is a really old text, and so it's difficult. All the translations are terrible. I worked through like 4 different translations trying to get through this book, and none of them were that great. It's also a mystic text, and so it's trying to be obscure on purpose. So that makes it really hard. So I'm going to read some from the Wikipedia summary of like what the Dark Night of the Soul was originally conceptualized to be. And so it says the dark night of the soul is a stage of final and complete purification and is marked by confusion, helplessness, stagnation of the will, and a sense of the withdrawal of God's presence. It is the final period of unselfing and the surrender to the hidden purposes of the divine will. And so this Catholic mystic's spiritual concept of the dark night of the soul was, you know, you're going along through your spiritual progress, you're feeling really connected with God, and then at some point, all of those benefits you're getting from your spiritual practices drop away, and you feel alone, and you feel like you're not getting anything from all of these things that used to work for you. You feel confused, helpless, and alone. And that's the dark night of the soul. And he makes a point that like this can go on for years, and like that is not abnormal. And it's a really interesting text to frame it that way. And I think that most cultures have kind of a concept of the dark night of the soul. And Joseph Campbell also talked about it as like something that comes just before needed revelation, when everything is lost and all seems darkness, then comes new life and all that is needed. And so it's kind of like in storytelling and in kind of these archetypes, it's the period that happens before the light. But when you're someone who's in it, you don't know that, as Elle has just pointed out to us. So let's discuss Kaladin's dark night of the soul here and this like moment of despair and failure that he goes through.
Liz, can I add one section to your mysticism? Not to actually, but to add in a little knowledge.
Please do, because I am not an expert on mysticism, so please.
I'm not either. I studied it for a year during my master's degree, and I think one thing that to focus here is that unselfing is the moment when you come into oneness with God, and that's like the key part of being a mystic. Is the entire purpose of mysticism. It is going to be a large, very like reductive view of it, basically, but it's to one yourself with God. It's to become as similar to God as you can be. And it makes me think of, I think it's Hadwick, who was like a German area mystic, and she, in her mystical text, just lays on the ground and just tries to exude no longer herself and become completely one with God. And it's that oneness with God that they're searching for and trying to find. And so like Campbell's idea of it like lost that you find new life, it's not just new life that you're finding, it's an entirely like connecting every single issue of your will with God. And I think that part is really important to think through for the Dark Night of the Soul, which is, I think, would be a little different than the Dark Night of the Soul when it comes to like a depressive moment. I think there's these two tensions, right? Where one is you have to live in this darkness for a long, long time and live with that darkness, where the other has that end goal and the end reaching of wanting yourself with God, of becoming entirely one with the being and the will and the mind of God, so that you are never tween, always one type of thing. So I think like there are these two operations for it, right? One being, and I think that's why you get out the Campbell, the like, then the light and the new life will come and you'll be all new. When for a lot of mystics, it wasn't about becoming new. It was just about no longer being. You are now completely, entirely with God afterward. And the newness of the life is something that I think Campbell adds in. But just to add a little bit of the layer to it and of that more spiritual religious side to it.
Yeah, I think Campbell does like try to generalize it more. But definitely the original is that like after you go through this period, this is a necessary period that you have to go through in order to become one with God. It's not something that can be avoided. And it's almost like he's writing that it's something that should be celebrated because it means you're almost there, which is so counterintuitive here. And reading this, knowing where Kaladin is going after this, that this is the moment that like Teft figures out what's going on, and like this is where Kaladin's powers become not subliminal but explicit. It can make us read that as like, oh yay, he finally made it. He's got his powers and now everything's gonna change. But I think it's important to also read like to really feel the failure and the darkness that Kaladin feels in this first chapter and this first half of the second chapter from this selection we're reading here.
I think that something that was notable to me when I was reading through the theme of surrender is that it doesn't actually feel like Kaladin ever does surrender. He is always holding on, and he's always like trying to, like, even at the end of the first chapter in this section, like, he is taking a breath. He is waiting for the storm wall to hit. He's like pushing through he's existing in the storm wall, and he's not giving up through all of this. And it reminds me, one of my favorite lines in a Taylor Swift song is from the song Long Story Short. And I really like the line, long story short, I survived, where she like gives this brief summary of like this experience she's going through. And then she's like, but despite that all, I survived. And like my own personal like change of that phrase that I kind of like let run through my mind is long story short, I survive. And then it always has a semicolon at the end of my head of like, I'm trying not to surrender to the feelings that I'm having, to the storm. And I think Kaladin like does a really good job at not surrendering to the tempest he is dealing with.
But on the other hand, he does do this thing where he puts all of his money on one bet, right? And that's kind of a surrendering thing of him saying, like, I'm not going to try to figure out a way to get cut down. I'm going to set that aside. I'm not going to figure out a way to avoid what's coming. I accept, like, I'm going to go through this storm experience. I'm going to set everything up so that if something good comes out of it, then great. But if not, I'm ready to accept that as well. Like, still asks him, do you want to be a miracle? And he says, no. Like, no, I don't want to make it through this. Like, I don't want to be the symbol anymore. But for them, I will be, right? So it's kind of like this contingent plan of like, I'm okay with either.
I think that like almost contrasts with the way I think about like the story of Christ with the crucifixion. Christ deliberately like surrenders his spirit and like takes that action to die because of his status as basically an immortal being of I have to deliberately surrender in order to die, whereas Kaladin like could die even without deliberately surrendering because he's human. And so like I think even though Kaladin is making the choice to say I'm going to gamble on this, he's still like he's not surrendering that hope of I will make it through this. Like there is that possibility that I could. And it doesn't feel as much of a surrender as I think like I see in like Christ with the crucifixion.
I think briefly to give back to the surrendering of the entire gamble, the thing that I found interesting narratively is that in taking this gamble, it's really what creates the characters of Teft and Moash is this moment when he opens his eyes. We get Teft's view of it, but Moash is also there. So what struck out to me in this reading was the first person who speaks to Cal is Moash. He says, Lord laying you awake. And he says, I'm conscious, Kaladin croaked. And so Moash is like a part of this, even if he's not like a core aspect to it. And he's been the person who's been so antagonistic to Kaladin, but it's this moment of miracle that happens that turns both him and Teft into believers of Kaladin. which is then what makes the what Moash sees as Kaladin's betrayal of him so stark in the end, right? Is this surrender forms two different characters that form, for me, foils throughout the rest of the text of Teft and Moash, right? Where Teft unifies his will with Kaladin's will. Moash does until he feels that utter betrayal of, you're not with me trying to stop the Light Eyes. Now you're trying to save them. And that is the betrayal that sends Moash off into the darkness. So it's this moment of him putting and surrendering everything onto that gamble that causes two of his little like lieutenant characters to have their largest arc, right? And it makes me think about, so the lines that really like pulled this out for me was when Kaladin and Syl were talking about him becoming a miracle. So Kaladin says, if I live, they'll remember it and it will give them hope. They might see it as a miracle. Syl says, do you want to be a miracle? Kaladin says, no, but for them, I will be. And there's this surrender of like the necessariness of being a miracle to get them out of their negative space, of being enslaved, of being a bridge crew, of et cetera, et cetera. But it's also, you don't quite know when you turn into that different layer of rising up and transcending above mere mortality into that sense of, I'm going to call it godliness. I don't think that's quite the right word here, but that sense of a higher plane that Kaladin enters post this moment. And eventually we learn it's actually the magic and the science of the system, right? But in invoking such a miraculous moment into this time, it's what, again, Teft is unified to Kaladin, and that's what leads ultimately to Teft's death at the hand of Moash. And Moash is unified all the moment until that betrayal. And I think that's a really interesting thing of what the surrender for Kaladin does, is it has echoes across the rest of the Cosmere almost.
And so I think this is the right moment for our World Hopper connection. And so we are going to be making a connection to the first book of the Mistborn series, The Final Empire. So if you have not read that book, now would be the time for you to leave. But I think it's interesting to compare this moment for Kaladin with being the miracle with Kelsier kind of pulls the same thing, right? Kelsier also is doing this. If I die and then come back, I can start this revolution. And what do we see as the differences between those two? Because I think there's a different emotional quality between the way Kelsier pulls off the death and resurrection and the way Kaladin is pulling off this kind of symbolic death and resurrection miracle here, even though they're both pulling from the same archetype.
I think Kaladin he's trying to be a symbol to his immediate crew, to his found family here. He's not actually trying to be a symbol to like the rest of the war camp. So what he wants is the other bridgemen to be the ones that see him and want to be there. He's not making this announcement to everybody. Whereas with Kelsier, he, like, the resurrected version of him appears to non-crew. And, like, he's being seen throughout the city. This is, like, a citywide thing. He is deliberate in taking on a symbol status, whereas Kaladin is trying to eschew, I don't remember how to pronounce that, you know what I mean. He's trying to not have that status placed upon him, which is why it's like an intimate setting. Kelsier's is much more like broad cultural movement.
What's interesting in relation to that is that Kelsier's is kind of a backup plan in some way. Right? He doesn't go plan to die in that moment. Kelsier's usually planning to live for the most part, but the backup plan is to go become a Christ-like figure. Whereas for Kaladin, all the K's. Come on, Brandon. For Kaladin, I wouldn't even call it a plan per se, but it is his only plan here. I'll just use the word, whatever, right? Whereas like with Kelsier, it's a backup plan. He doesn't know for sure if he's going to die, but it's always there in the contract with Orsur. But for Kaladin, this is his only path forward. He's like, it's this or I'm dead. Whereas for Kelsier, it was, I'm going to live life until this moment happens. And then all of my plans will work. And narratively, it'll all figure out in the plot. But I I think that's a different dimension to it, where for one, it's like their only path forward. For the other, it's their backup plan. Even though for Kelsier, it's more deliberate than Kaladin, because Kaladin's having it forced upon him, whereas Kelsier was like, yeah, this is how you start a revolution.
And I think that's why, like, this feels like a surrender, because Kaladin doesn't choose it. He's allowing it to happen if it happens. He's just, like, what will be, will be. I'm just going to see if I survive this. And, like, he puts this seed, but it's mostly, like, almost like him just trying to leave some comfort with them rather than, like, him actually wanting to survive. He seems to have accepted either way that this turns out at this point.
Well, it's also surrender in a way because Kaladin at any time could be chopped down. Like the bridge crew thought about it and they thought about the consequences, but he could still ask to like not have to weather the storm itself, right? There are other decisions that he could have made in that moment, which are not very happy decisions, right? There are ones that he's already said he won't take, like the moment at the edge of the chasm and things like that. So this is like a surrender to this pathway forward, even if there are other options in some different way. So I think that's a interesting thing when it's like also, it brings up the question of like, can you surrender in the moment when all of your choices are technically taken from you? Which I think is highlighted again with the bridge crew trying to make that decision of like, can we cut you down? If we cut you down, they'll kill us all. And so it's like, can you surrender in a moment where you have no power? Or is surrendering a form of power?
I think that's why, like, I feel like I've had such a different reaction to this, like, section than, like, both of you seem to have had. Where, like, to me, moments that feel like what Kaladin's feeling here feel like there are no options. The option is either to surrender, and that feels like an active option, or to keep going through it. And, like, for Kaladin, like, he is continuing to go through it. Surrendering would be to be opting out of the situation to some way, to, like, to let go of the chain that he's holding on to. And he does not have any options. And when you're, like, in that situation, then the only option is either you get to surrender or you don't. And, like, so to me, Kaladin's, like, he's choosing not to surrender because that's the only option that's left to him. And he's not taking it. He's still trying to... He's continuing to keep going through it because he is hopeful that there is some chance that he won't always feel like this. There's some chance he could make it through the storm. And so, I don't know. I think that's where I, like, see it differently of, like, I don't think that he does have any choices. And so surrender becomes his only choice, if that makes sense.
To bring that a little bit back around to our discussion about Christ earlier and about the surrender of the atonement itself, where we're pulling on the Mormon atonement theory of, I think this is somewhat general Christian. It depends on denomination, of course, but that sense of like Christ surrenders it all when he says, Father, take this cup from me. And then he gets even further away when God removes his spirit from him. And so he is left all alone. So now he has no other options except to surrender to the death of the cross itself, which I think really highlighted well in like what you're talking about, Al, but also makes you wonder. And it's always the difference that I was taught in Sunday school or seminary or in secret talks with high priests, right? But that sense of like no one else could do what Jesus did because Jesus was divine and he was the one who was able to go that one extra step of full surrender, whereas we as human beings, since God never leaves us, can not fully surrender ever. And I think there's something interesting about that in relation to our conversation with surrender. I don't know what type of interesting thing is, but it just like flashed that Mormon memory in my brain of, Christ always going one step further because he could, whereas we can't go all that way with Christ.
And I think there is a lot of intentional, like, crucifixion, resurrection symbolism here. I have to give credit for this to this fabulous paper that I heard at the American Academy of Religion conference by Jennifer Lehman. She is a lecturer at Santa Clara University in Hebrew Bible, but she presented this paper reading this scene, and especially the second chapter. We're reading this little end scene with Teft showing up and Kaladin opening his eyes through the lens of doubting Thomas, and like Teft going through this experience of like having his hopes dashed and saying like, well, you almost made me believe it was true. And then this moment of like, and yes, it is true. He's still alive. And yes, all the things that like your parents and your religious tradition thought would happen have now happened, and they happened to you. So I could not, having heard her paper, I could not help but like see a lot of connections that are being made in here. We have this moment where like all of the bridgemen leave him, and like Teft thinks about trying to stay with him, but then like calls himself a coward and like leaves and goes into the barracks. And like this very, very much parallels kind of the biblical symbolism of like the disciples being unable to stay awake in the Garden of Gethsemane and be with Christ, and then Peter denying him, and like him being all alone. And Kaladin really does feel like people have deserted him. And then we do have that moment though in the middle of the storm where he sees Syl standing up for him, right? And that reminded me a lot of this thing that's not in all of the Gospels, but in some of them, that like an angel came and comforted Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. And like, I think like it's pretty clear that Syl fills that role of him not being entirely alone, but still feeling like he is alone. And then there's, of course, the connection that Peter, the apostle's name, means rock. And rock is also one of the first people to show up. Anyway, I think there's lots of connections. I do have to believe that like that connection and drawing on that symbolism is intentional, because it is an example of kind of this dark night experience where like the New Testament is describing something that is very dark and deep, and like a difficult thing that people went through, that a person went through one time. And then, you know, the eucatastrophe, as Tolkien would say, like the miracle of the resurrection. And like, we're feeling that through these two chapters. But it's only meaningful because we went through that dark night.
The art that I think of when you talk about the angel in the garden is Franz Schwartz's The Agony in the Garden. It was on display at BYU when I was there, and there were a number of times where I would just go and stand or sit in front of that piece because I really liked it. And I really like you pulling out Syl as this idea of the angel during this while Christ is in the garden. One of the ideas I've had is, I don't have any tattoos, but if I were to get a tattoo, one of them is the long story short, I survive words that I would put. And the other one is this drawing of Syl that was in beta art for the Shards of Creation. It's like a line drawing. And the idea of like having Syl with me all the time is something that like just like makes me happy to think about. So even though I don't like actually have that tattoo, it's like a little bit of a mental one. And so like drawing that connection of like Syl being like holding back as much as the storm as she can. And like at this point, she doesn't have much of a bond. So she can't grow as much as she can in future books, but she is trying anyway. It's just, I really like that imagery and symbolism.
I was also at BYU when that Franz Schwartz painting was at the BYU Museum of Art. And I wrote my last paper in my first year writing class on that painting. But what I wanted to briefly pull in here was how Syl standing and representing the angel that visited Jesus is interesting when you think about some Mormon feminists who argue that that angel was Heavenly Mother visiting Jesus before the crucifixion, and that longer argument in that strain of Mormonism of like that angel being feminized and being, the ultimate matriarch of all of us humans here down on Earth. It's interesting when you think about Syl and Syl being is it the ancient one? Is that what they call her? The ancient daughter or whatever. Syl's purpose and her core centrality in the entire series of being the person who's helping to restore and being the person who's also like, bringing about the change that's needed to fight odium, right?
Which then kind of reminds me of the Mormon concept of the fall with Adam and Eve, and how Eve is lauded as making the right choice to eat the fruit and to leave the garden. Like where Syl is like, I could have stayed in lasting integrity and been this good little honor spren, but instead I left and I disobeyed my father, and I went and found Kaladin to help protect him. And I don't know, it's just kind of an interesting addition to build off of that.
The other last thing I wanted to bring up before we maybe move to our sacred reading method is that we again have the return of the very artistic and observant language from Kaladin, which we've noticed in a couple of our other episodes, but we get lots of sensory details in these chapters. We get the smell of the crisp, chill air, and Syl is feeling cold, the blood trickling down his face. And and then when we get into the storm, we get the storm very much personified. I mean, this is one of those places where it's like, Brandon Sanderson is usually a clear window pane writer, but here's a place where he's chosen to on purpose, I'm going to use lots of metaphors and imagery and really pay attention to the craft of what it would be like to be strung up in a high storm, and just the personification of this storm as a beast. And there's all these verbs of ripping and tearing, and the white teeth in the night. The lightning is like white teeth, and the thunder as the heartbeat of the beast. And just these sensory details. And that's really interesting to me in terms of the Dark Night of the Soul, because one of the things that St. John of the Cross talks about in his summary of what it's like to go through the Dark Night of the Soul is that you lose all of these sensory experiences, that all the senses have to be put to sleep in order to become at one with God. And we do reach this moment after all these sensory details when Kaladin blinks and everything is quiet. There's no lightning, there's no wind, there's no rain. And he even feels restrained from speaking, because this moment of no sensory detail is sacred and important, and reaching that point of union with, whatever sacredness there is, and this, the Storm Father or whatever it is appearing to him. And he's not certain about that experience, but it happens to him. And it's not something that is through a lot of noise and emotional description, but it's very spare at that point after all of this very verbose and intentional metaphor that's going on at the beginning of the chapter. I think that helps create this moment for us as readers.
Well, that's really interesting, because that's what you would expect from a conclusion to a part, not this still introduction to a part, right? I just did the pages, and we're still 200 pages until this part ends. And so it's interesting that this very big emotional moment happens here, especially when Sanderson's writing gets classified into the Brandalanche, or however you pronounce it, right? That avalanche of knowledge at the very end, the last 200 pages. But we get this very stark emotional moment at the beginning of a chapter, in this high moment, in this moment where Brandon is paying attention to language, is paying attention to all of these things to craft them, not in the reward of the end to the part, but as a way to then build up the latter part of this this section of the Way of Kings. So I think that organizationally is really interesting, where this is happening near the beginning and not near the end, which is what we usually expect from a writer like him, or what has come to be his mythos of being a writer.
You've reminded me that I have this theory that perhaps these books are organized more like a Shakespearean play, because in Shakespeare, like the crucial moment happens in Act 3. Like that's when the decision is made that upon which the rest of the plot turns. And Act 4 and 5 are dealing with the fallout from that. So I have wondered and have not gone through and done the analysis myself, but like, can you read Stormlight through like that way that we have mapped Shakespearean plots of like the crucial thing happens in Act 3 and what we think of as the Sanderlanche in Act 4 is all a result of like this moment in Act 3, right in the middle.
I've also had that thought, Liz. So maybe next summer we should write a paper together.
Yeah.
Which, for the uninitiated listener, inviting a fellow academic to write a paper is saying you're cool.
Well, thank you. Okay. So we're going to move from here into our sacred reading method. And for our sacred reading method, I've chosen to do Lectio Divina, but we're going to do it a little different than the way we've done it in the past. Because of this connection that we've made this chapter to the mystic experience and meditation and more of like the quiet, less analytical side of spirituality, I wanted to try a version of Lectio Divina that is more contemplative. And so this method has 4 steps in it. The first is Lectio, which is to read the passage. And then the second step is meditatio, which is meditation. So we're going to meditate on a specific portion of the passage, find something to sit with for a minute and notice something about it. The next step would be oratio, which is to respond to the passage. In a Christian context, this would be where you pray about what you've noticed and talk with God about it or do some journaling. We will kind of incorporate maybe our wisdom of the heralds into this moment and say, what do we feel like this passage means for us? How can we personalize that passage? And then our final step will be contemplatio. You love my Latin pronunciation, you know it, which I totally don't have, which is contemplation, which is to like engage in a moment of quiet and rest with the passage. So we are going to end this podcast with a minute or 2 of silence for you to contemplate this and engage in this on your own as a listener. And, maybe find a moment of quiet and not engaging with outside thoughts or with analyticalness, but to be in that kind of mystical meditative space. So that's our plan. I'm going to start out by reading a passage, and it's from the end of chapter 34. I'm going to read, it's a little less than a page, but it's kind of long. So we'll only read it once, and then we'll come back to some other portions of it. But I want us to kind of read slowly. So I'm going to read it out loud, and we're going to kind of be in the reading as we do it. So, it was a desperate, foolish hope. The eastern horizon, inverted in his sight, was growing darker. From this perspective, the storm was like the shadow of some enormous beast lumbering across the ground. He felt the disturbing fuzziness of a person who had been hit too hard on the head. Concussion. That was what it was called. He was having trouble thinking, but he didn't want to fall unconscious. He wanted to stare at the high storm straight on, though it terrified him. He felt the same panic he'd felt looking down into the black chasm, back when he'd nearly killed himself. It was the fear of what he could not see, what he could not know. The storm wall approached, the visible curtain of rain and wind at the advent of a high storm. It was a massive wave of water, dirt, and rocks, hundreds of feet high, thousands upon thousands of windspread zipping before it. In battle, he'd been able to fight his way to safety with the skill of his spear. When he'd stepped to the edge of the chasm, there had been a line of retreat. This time there was nothing. No way to fight or avoid that black beast, that shadow spanning the entirety of the horizon, plunging the world into an early night. The eastern edge of the crater that made the war camp had been worn away, and Bridge 4's barrack was the first in its row. There was nothing between him and the plains. Nothing between him and the storm. Staring at that raging, blustering, churning wave of wind-pushed water and debris, Kaladin felt as if he were watching the end of the world descend upon him. He took a deep breath, the pain of his ribs forgotten, as the storm wall crossed the lumberyard in a flash and slammed into him. Okay, so that was our reading. And now we're going to do a little bit of meditation on the passage. So I'm going to give us a minute or two to contemplate this passage, read through it again, and maybe pick a sentence or two that stands out to you and what we notice from it. Hey, do we have any thoughts from meditating on this reading? What have we noticed?
I was looking at the line, no way to fight or avoid that black beast. One of the metaphors that's often used for depression is like the black dog. And I was just kind of thinking about how, like, there are some times where, like, I feel like a storm wall hits me where, like, my depression kind of comes on suddenly and I don't feel prepared, and it just, like, it's overwhelming and there's nothing between me and, you know, the black beast, the black dog, the storm. And sometimes I do, like, Kaladin, I can watch it approach, but even then, regardless of which way it comes on me, it feels like there is not a way to fight it or avoid it. There's ways to attempt to tame it or to, like, shelter from it, but there's not a way to escape the storm.
I feel weird following that. Very insightful comment by L. My line that I focused in on was thousands upon thousands of wind sprints zipping before it. Whenever I see Sprin now, after reading the entire series, I always think of the little creation Sprin who are like, Shalom, Shalom, Shalom. And they're all jumping to be her armor. And so whenever I see Sprin, I always just think they're the friends that you're going to meet along the way. And I hear it's like a big giant wall of darkness bearing down upon him. But there are these thousands of wind Sprin here who are responding in their own way to the storm, of course. They're not yet going to form his armor or anything like that, but it makes me think of the potentiality of what's in the darkness, which is why I didn't quite want to follow Elle's comments with that, because I don't want to draw a connection here of, like, when you're walking into that darkness, there's always the potential of light within it. Like, that's something I'm not trying to do here, but I do. That's what I thought about when I thought about these zipping little wind sprint coming along. I'm like, some of those could be part of his armor. And it's, for me, I don't suffer from depression. I suffer from sadness occasionally, but nothing like depression or anything like that. But I always want to remember about the community that's around me and the community that I sometimes, almost always, forget that I have when it comes to, you know, those moments when you're inside yourself and you're not being external to yourself.
I mean, those wind sprints stood out to me as well. And I think they kind of add to the awe that's happening here. And awe in the old sense of, like, realizing your smallness as a person and how much you don't control. And, like, it's not just a hurricane. This is like a supernatural hurricane coming for you. And just, like, that feeling of helplessness as a human before, you know, the natural and supernatural forces of Roshar. But the sentence I was looking at was from the end, the sentence of Kaladin felt as if he were watching the end of the world descend upon him. And I think that can often be the worst thing for me when I'm going through something really hard, is when you see, oh no, this is going to happen and now I have no choice but to go through it. And just, like, that sinking feeling and the desire not to see what I've seen and to know and to not know what I know is coming. That adds so much to, like, the dread and the difficulty of going through this experience, because you know what's going to happen and you have to face it anyway. So our next step in our Lectio Divina is to respond to the passage and think about what it's calling us to do. And this is kind of our wisdom of the heralds-ish segment, but like what do we feel personally called to by meditating upon this passage of the storm approaching? I guess I can start. For me, it was kind of the next sentence after the one I shared of this, like, taking a deep breath before the storm wall hits and going in and just, bracing yourself for it. And it's okay to need to do that before going into something hard. I do tend to be an avoidant person when it comes to dealing with hard things. And so, like, that kind of centering practice of the deep breath and then the accepting what must be of surrendering to it, I think is very helpful for me.
I think for me, I am sitting with that section as well for a little bit. Mostly because I always try to live life with a sense of it's like, this is my first time living as 33-year-old in plus days, right? This is the first day that I'm living this day, and I won't get this day again. And so I think the sense that I'm getting here is, it says Kaladin felt as if he were watching the end of the world descend upon him, and it externalizes this thing that's occurring to him, and he becomes an observer in this text, right, where he's watching it descend upon him. And then he takes a deep breath, pain forgotten, and then the storm all hits. But it's that sense of like, Kaladin's living that day. I need to live each day, not only going forward into the storm, but also watching the storm as it descends. And so that sense of like being able to recognize that each day is a new day, you're living through it, but it's your first and your last day of that day. And so to observe what happens to you while you live with what happens in your life at the same time is something that I'm going to be thinking about going forward.
Ironically, I'm thinking about Adam's comment after my comment from the last section of reminding myself that I do have community, that the Windsprend aren't specifically supporting Kaladin through this particular storm, but they eventually become part of his community, so to speak. And I think finding ways that I can let the community help me, or ways that do work to reach out or not completely isolate myself when I'm struggling would be important, and is something that I want to try to do better at in my life.
Okay, and our final step in the Lectio Divina is a moment of contemplation to rest in the passage. So we leave you, dear reader, dear listener, to weather the storm with Kaladin.